Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. I'm simply not going to waste a lot of time building up a long intro. If you're here, I'm sure you want to quickly get started. But yeah, I gotta tell you, these are 12 of the most fascinating Hellraiser stories you'll come across. We went through all the 20 Hellraiser comic issues from the original volume to bring you these. Oh, and hey, if you have a story in your mind that we missed, please let me know in the comments. And now, let's begin. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Canons of Pain. The Levant was the holiest of the lands, and since the death of Christ, the place has seen countless crusades to return his artifacts to the true seat of civilization and learning in the world. In the process, countless lives were lost. Men and women were left to die in the dust and sand so that his truth could be better known. After all, piety came at a high cost. Castle Carillion in France was the seat of the Count of Carillion, who was currently on a crusade to return the arrow-pierced shroud of Saint Rubrub to France. In his absence, Lady Carillion aptly managed the fiefdom, which is the third largest in all of France. One afternoon, she's visited by Father Robitaille. He'd come to seek her permission to hold the feats of St. Jude on the day of the next new moon, but Lady Carillion tells him that he doesn't need her permission because the church reigns over the land and the parish's worship of the Lord far exceeded the concern for the permission of a mere landlord. Clearly, Lady Carillion and her husband were pretty pious people. Father Robitaille thanks her for her benevolence and kind words, but he seems troubled. So, Lady Carillion asks him what the matter was, and he tells her about a troubling dream he's been seeing for some time now. He says, "I fear that a great evil will soon be visited upon us all, a great evil that your husband will bring back with him from his crusade." Dude, couldn't be more right. Meanwhile, Count of Carillion was out there fighting the crusade in the Middle East and prepared to enter a property that was supposed to hold something valuable, something that possibly belonged to Jesus. But as he enters, he finds nothing but a golden box, and the Count is disappointed. He returns home with the box. It had been a year and 7 months since the Lord and the Lady had met. She presents herself to him and calls him to bed, but he's in no mood. He tells her that she couldn't imagine the horrors he'd endured and the losses he'd sustained, but it was all for naught. He did it all for a mere ornate box, whose mention was nowhere to be found, not in the Gospels, not in any scriptures. The Count started to believe that he'd lost God's purpose. He was feeling lost. Lady Carillion tells him that he had her, but that didn't mean anything to him. A year passed, and since her husband had fallen so much into despair that he let his lands and household crumble, Lady Carillion decided to take matters into her own hands. She started helping Father Robitaille, who had ascended to the ranks of Monsignor, but kept fighting evil. And in order to truly fight evil, one must know how evil functions and the tools it uses. She started messing around with the puzzle box. I'm sure that by now you understand that this puzzle box was the lament configuration, the same puzzle that summoned Cenobites when solved. She believed that she would be summoning the devil so that he could be banished to the same hellish pits that spawned him, but she was wrong. So yeah, she opens the box and a Cenobite appears with its Cenobite pet. If you haven't figured it out yet, this Cenobite was Grillard. Needless to say, Lady Carillion's fate was more or less sealed, but the Count arrived just in time to find out what was happening. He was worried about what his wife was doing, but Grillard summoned spears from hell, from the labyrinth, with which Grillard struck the Count before taking him to hell. Lady Carillion and Robitaille were left behind in the wake of this gruesome event, but they vowed to save the Count from his sorry fate by bringing him back from the labyrinth. The two of them executed a small inquisition of sorts in their fiefdom. They did it all. Baptisms, exorcisms, burning and bleeding at the stake of those found guilty of trafficking any kind of sin. Interestingly enough, Robitaille and Lady Carillion fell in love and rocked the bed under the sheets. Soon, the young hot woman was pregnant with Robitaille's child. One thing led to another, and Grillard was summoned once again. This time around, Grillard crucified Robitaille. But wait, Lady Carillion awakens from her slumber, as if it were all just a bad dream. But no, in the days to come, she delivers Robitaille's child and is shocked to find the same birthmark as Count Carillion, which means that he was allowed to be reincarnated as his wife's child, which is, weird. But more importantly, he was bound to walk the path of evil and sin. The Warm Red. In the story titled The Warm Red, we meet Brian Rhodes, a cattle rancher whose business tanked. The dude makes a deal with Face, the Cenobite, to hand over tortured souls using his scalpel. But things can't be so simple with Hellraiser comics, so we get Maureen Endicott, who tries to charm Brian into selling his land for an amusement park. But Brian has other plans. He drugs her and sets her up for Face, but the spicy bit is yet to come. Brian calls up Face using the lament configuration and offers Maureen as a new soul. But Maureen was a quick thinker, and she cut her own deal with Face, offering up future amusement park goers instead. Face, intrigued, tests her by having her torture Brian, who was tied naked to a bed before Maureen could start her work on him as a sort of audition. This story was a bit too hot for Marvel back in the day. Daniel Chichester, the editor of Clive Barker's Hellraiser series, revealed that Marvel thought the warm red was way too disturbing to print. They believed it was too much. You know, the sexual stuff, the nudity, and a no-go for the first issue. But Chichester ensured that the story was published. But come on, the comic was supposed to be disturbing. It's Clive Barker's Hellraiser, for crying out loud. Diver's Hands. The story begins at Carbarrow Hanson's Disease Center in Louisiana, the only leper colony in the entire region. To manage the more serious patients, the hospital hires another nurse named Mary, who gets immediately curious about this man named Vincent, an educated fellow who contracted the disease in Mexico, but was sent here because he was an American. Vincent carried the lament configuration with him all the time, and it made Mary more and more curious. She tended to him, brought him medicines, and changed his clothes. And it wasn't before long that she was spending too much time with Vincent, so much so that she was ignoring other patients, and Dr. Watkins brought this to the attention of Mary. Later that night, she was making love to her boyfriend, but she was still thinking about Vincent and his puzzle box. Her obsession now reached a point where she was imagining Vincent while her boyfriend did things to her in bed. The following morning, she goes to Vincent and asks him more about the puzzle box. Vincent begins telling her his story. He contracted the disease a few years ago. He couldn't really tell if it was 2 or 10. Anyway, he was a student studying Indian culture. There were jungles, and he liked it despite the heat and the wet air. He felt alive there, like he hadn't before or since. He must have come into contact with someone who had the bacillus, but he couldn't tell for sure. At any rate, at the time he noticed the first lesion on his skin, the nodule on his nose. He discovered something else too. He'd been told about and had also read about a man called Le Marchand, the man who designed the lament configuration, and in that moment, he knew that he was saved from his predicament. Quite obviously, Mary asks him what he meant by saved. I mean, he wasn't an ignorant man, and the disease he'd contracted could have been arrested with help. But for some strange reason, he didn't get any medication. She asks him the reason, but he says it's really foolish to arrest the disease when he can grow out of it, when he can rid himself of it entirely. He began to look for the lament configuration instead of finding medication because the places he was looking for the puzzle box were bereft of any sulfur drugs. Vincent had to choose between the two options. He could either take a shot at getting cured forever while letting the disease get worse, or he could find medical help and live in the shadow of Hanson's disease forever. The man made his choice. Soon, he found his cube. However, by the time he got the puzzle box, his hands had gone useless. He couldn't work it any longer. Vincent's gaze belonged to Mary's now, to her own hands. Vincent stares, not at his precious configuration, but at a new prize. The slim, beautiful fingers that are poised above the puzzle. She asks how the box could possibly help him, and he says that it opens a door to another place, and the people who would come out of that door, the Cenobites, can repair his body and perhaps give him a new one. But she doesn't believe him. She thinks it was all fantasy, and yet she agrees to help him with whatever he wants. Vincent takes her to this place within the center that Mary didn't even know existed. Mary tries to solve the puzzle, and before long, Cenobites appear. Dark figures stride out of the light, angels to some and demons to others. Twist in the story, Vincent was working for the Cenobites. He'd made a deal with them, souls who open the lament configuration in exchange for getting turned into a Cenobite. They take Mary and turn her into one of them, but return for Vincent because another puzzle has been solved. You see, the entire center was basically a configuration, and Vincent had somehow solved it. He's carried down, to be plucked from his cage of flesh, to be melded into some form more useful to the Cenobites. And that's where our story ends. The blood of a poet. The blood of a poet pretty much feels like Lovecraft penned down a Hellraiser story. And that's gotta be amazing, right? It revolves around a young poet from Paris who's in need of a place to stay so that he can get enough time to hone his skills while remaining in a culturally rich city. Fair enough. However, he soon discovers a house, Pension Veneur, which basically gives away free room and board to all kinds of artists. But of course, there's a catch. There always is one in a Hellraiser story. So the catch was that the artists had to work on the art that belonged to this retreat. Among the other residents of the place were a tinkerer, a musician, an artist, a painter, and a sculptress. At the dinner the first night that the poet stays at Pension Veneur, the tinkerer brings up the topic of Le Marchand, but the others quickly ask him to zip it. Later that night, the poet experiences some really terrifying nightmares, but something good comes out of them. He got inspiration for some poetry. This kind of reminds me of the S.T. Coleridge poem titled Kubla Khan, in which the man claimed that he got the inspiration for the poem from an opium-induced sleep. Anyway, time passes and the poet stays at the retreat. Although he begins to descend into madness, he pens down some really powerful poetry. It's only later that he learned that the house belonged to this Le Marchand guy, and something or someone called Cenobites would one day be summoned so that they could judge the art that the artists living in Le Marchand's house create. The Cenobites would make sure that the art was of such a horrifying nature and degree that only the creatures and denizens of hell would be able to endure beholding it. A few more days pass. and the time finally comes when the Cenobites are summoned. Among the party that arrives are Pinhead, the Chatterer, and the female Cenobite, and of course they bring along a few pets. The only person who truly impresses the Cenobites is the poet, while all others meet a fate worse than death. The poet initially thinks that it was all a dream, but soon realizes that whatever happened the previous day was in fact real. Furthermore, he's made the new guardian of Pension Venure, and his only job is to bring in more prospective artists who would create similar art for the Cenobites to appreciate. Who knew that these sadomasochistic demons could be into art? The songs of metal and flesh. This one was written by none other than the screenwriter of the second and third Hellraiser films, Peter Atkins. So anyway, the Songs of Metal and Flesh is centered around this musical prodigy named Jason. Unfortunately for him, he went blind at a very young age. But you may call it a blessing in disguise because his blindness actually paved the way for his other senses to come to life. I mean, they compensated for the lost eyesight, and Jason soon discovered that he had a particular proclivity toward music. When Jason came to college, he was still unaware of the horrors that lay in the world and how evil people could really be. So there was this other musician, a rival to Jason, who was jealous of how good Jason was at what he did. So one day, out of jealousy, the rival musician placed razor blades between the piano keys of the piano that Jason was supposed to play. Needless to say, he was hurt, but Jason didn't give up. He brought himself to focus on his music and compositions, and his education ultimately led him to discover that the music could reveal secrets to the world if the musical notes were just right. However, the only way for him to really get it out of himself was by actually getting it out of himself. Literally. You might be wondering, how? So, what he does is cover a door with razor blades and crawl on this deadly door. Furthermore, he dances on it, blood dripping on his bloody music sheet. Next, he practically converts these drops of blood into his symphony, into his musical notes. Somehow, he manages to convince his college rival to play the masterpiece of blood that he just created, and as the music plays, the Cenobites arrive and annihilate everyone with their chains and blades. Everyone but Jason. No, they don't spare him. He'd created a musical version of the lament configuration and opened the gates to the labyrinth. So the Cenobites took him to the labyrinth. His eyesight returns to him, but he loses all his other senses. And of course, the Cenobites do their thing on him to prepare a face. In 1923, Lon Chaney was known in the biz as a master of disguise and a real character actor. He had a knack for making his roles super realistic because of his crazy makeup and mask work. But when I say he used some crazy makeup and mask, I mean crazy. Really crazy. The guy was so into his craft that he went to the extreme of literally peeling off a dude's face, Fagin, for a more authentic look in his Oliver Twist role. This caught the eye of Leviathan, and the next thing you know, Pinhead steps in. He kills Fagin and offers Chaney the face as a kind of twisted bonus. Chaney's career kept skyrocketing, and he got super hooked on the face-stealing thing. While prepping for the Hunchback of Notre Dame, he snatched the face of Henrik, a freak show performer in London. So yeah, you could say that this guy was quite dedicated to his job and was all about getting into character, but for all the wrong reasons. Things got personal when Chaney proposed to Patty Ruth Miller, his girl, but she was already engaged to Norman Carey, Chaney's work buddy. Chaney didn't take the rejection well, and I guess guys like him, they can never take any kind of rejection well. Quite as expected, he went after Carey and scarred his face with sulfuric acid. But Detective Murray was on his tail for the previous face-stealing shenanigans. Chaney had to escape. It turns out that Pinhead has been pulling the strings all along. After Chaney's last run-in with the law, Pinhead whisked him off to hell, where Chaney got a hellish makeover into the Cenobite simply called Face. Now the guy was stuck with a bunch of stapled faces on his head and ran the Grand Theatre in hell. A far cry from his silver screen dreams, but still in the spotlight, albeit in a twisted way. Mazes of the Mind. Now, this story deals with Eremites, a special kind of creature from the Hellraiser universe. So, before I get into the comic, let me brief you about Eremites. These are the offspring of the Cenobite Orno and a human. Through them, Orno sends his essence to Earth, like a supernatural FedEx delivery. 9 months later, out pops an Eremite baby. They're basically demons in human skin, quite literally. When they reach the age of 16, these kids receive a special gift from Orno, a puzzle box they must guard. So it's both a twisted birthday present and their coming-of-age ritual. In the Hellraiser comics, Orno is busy crafting new roads to hell and playing daddy to these puzzle guardians. His appearance is as bizarre as you'd expect for a Cenobite. Ghostly white skin, heavy blue robes with his chest exposed, and his face adorned with a silver arrow-pin cushion with wires pulling his skin in all sorts of directions. The puzzle boxes, however, are where things get really interesting. Eremites, also known as keepers, take care of these puzzle boxes around the clock. You could say that they serve as the ultimate secret agents or sleeper cells of hell, and often hide in plain sight while safeguarding these boxes. Unlike their Cenobite cousins, who enjoy hanging out together, Eremites are lone wolves. Their mission is to uphold Leviathan's will on Earth, all on their own. They blend in with human society and give away these puzzle boxes to people so that they can be taken to hell. In Mazes of the Mind, the short story from the 5th issue of Clive Barker's Hellraiser, we get to see exactly how Orno works. Orno revels in the fact that Leviathan loves him not for his flesh, but for his mind. His gift lies in creating new guardians and pathways to hell. For Orno, his private hell isn't his flesh, it's his thoughts. His relentless pursuit of a pure formula or equation. The puzzle box is his mathematical gateway, a means to transcend his fleshy form and approach the purity of an equation. Flesh, to Orno, is trivial, a mere test of elasticity. Leviathan provides Orno with everything he needs. A private workshop in hell and an endless supply of raw material. When Leviathan calls, Orno's job is to create new guardians and gateways. In this story, we witness a few Cenobites bringing in a man referred to only as raw material, a fitting name for someone whose sole purpose is to serve as a step in creating something else. The exterior of the raw material is irrelevant. It's the insides that matter. Orno straps the raw material to a chair fitted with multiple tubes. One of these tubes covers the man's mouth, into which Orno pours his own seed. He then slices open the raw material's scalp and skull, revealing the brain, a process Orno calls the opening of the maze. Reading the maze of the mind, Orno feels the man's mortality, quirks, expectations, and carnal desires. The mind of this particular raw material isn't complex, but Orno finds it sufficient to start with. Next, Orno tastes the brain, a gross, cannibalistic step. This prepares the raw material. But what about the gateway, the puzzle box? Orno picks up a blank box, explaining that each piece must be shaped and formed, reflecting both strengths and weaknesses. These pieces grow together to create a new gateway. In the final step, Orno packs up the cut-open raw material and feeds him the desire to reproduce. This desire will birth a new guardian, someone who will protect and love the puzzle box. The raw material is sent back to Earth to mate with a prostitute. After the deed, the raw material dies immediately, as Orno's genes shouldn't be passed on. The mother also dies during childbirth, and the child becomes a guardian of the puzzle box upon turning 16. Thus, Orno's genes pave new avenues to hell. Under the Knife. Under the Knife is basically a story that blends Jack the Ripper and the Hellraiser universe into one compact and thrilling cocktail. According to the story, Jack was searching for a gateway to hell called the Heart of Damnation. So, like any self-respecting seeker of hell, he thinks the best way to go about it is through murdering prostitutes on the streets of London. After murdering his 25th victim named Mary Kelly, he practically rips her heart open. It's later revealed that Jack was actually looking for the heart to further his diabolical agenda. Jack then writes several letters to multiple newspapers and asks them to publish stories about him. He finds one article particularly interesting. The article was published in a newspaper called The Penny Illustrated. He rips out the page and burns the article in order to open the gates of hell or the Heart of Damnation. Soon after, he's turned into a Cenobite. Much later, in the year 1991, Dr. Glenda Martinet was researching Jack the Ripper, and in her obsession with the serial killer, she became a copycat killer, and the papers named her the Chicago Ripper. She murders 3 people, and then reaches out to a reporter named Hank Windell so that, much like Jack, she can also get her stories published in newspapers. Next thing we know, she murders Hank and burns the article that he'd written, thereby solving the newspaper version of the lament configuration, which was called the Heart of Damnation. The gateway that the Heart of Damnation opens summons Saucy Jack, and alongside him are others like the Engineer, Butterball, Bright Eyes, and the Voice. We've explored all these Cenobites in our video on all Cenobites ever from the Hellraiser universe. You might want to check it out. The Cenobites want to take Glenda to the labyrinth, but Jack stabs the Heart of Damnation, which infuriates Saucy Jack, who orders his Cenobite friends to slaughter both Jack and Glenda. The Harrowing, Parts 1 and 2. Long ago, the goddess Morte Mame got tricked by her brother Leviathan and ended up trapped in a puzzle chamber called Morte's Tomb in Joplin, Missouri. Leviathan wasn't playing fair. He used his Cenobite army to make sure she stayed locked up, but Morte Mame, being the resilient goddess she is, saw an opportunity to break free. She chose 6 warriors, dubbed the Harrowers, to take on Leviathan and his demonic crew. Sadly, Leviathan outsmarted them, leading to their demise and keeping Morte Mame stuck in the tomb. A few years later, Morte Mame uses maggots to chew through her flesh and shed their skin to find new warriors to help her out. Yeah, you heard that right, maggots. And it worked. The ground above her tomb cracked open, waking up Bunny Benedict, the keeper of the Legs Benedict's Egg Museum. Side note, what's even in an egg museum? Fossilized caveman omelets or something. Anyway, The quake caused a fissure, and those magic-infused maggots escaped. While Bunny was busy swatting at them, unaware of their purpose, in hell, Leviathan was freaking out. He summoned the General, this Cenobite dude with spikes coming out of his head and shoulders. Leviathan saw his sister rallying new allies to Joplin and wasn't having it, so the General called in Merkova's Lucky Six, another batch of Cenobites, specifically chosen to crush the Harrowers and keep Morte Mame locked up for good. In New York City, there was a tattoo artist named Ron Ringwood. He gets stung by one of Morte Mame's magical flies while he's working and gets a telepathic message from the goddess herself. Next thing you know, he's tattooing Joplin, Missouri on a customer and heading out on his bike. Meanwhile, over in Ohio State Penitentiary, Vera Wyshak is on death row. During her last rites, a priest tries to save her soul, but she's not having any of it. Then, one of Morte Mame's flies lands in the priest's coffee. He drinks it, gets possessed, and tells Vera to go to Joplin before dying. Vera escapes wearing the priest's clothes. In St. Louis, Missouri, Winston Gage, who works at an animal shelter, finds a kitten that dodged euthanasia. The kitten swallows one of the flies, and later Winston finds it with a tag that says, "My name is Zinc, Joplin's city license." So he packs up and heads to Joplin with the kitten. Down in Tennessee, twin sisters Lavinia and Lucinda Clare, bored out of their minds at Graceland, are planning their next stop. A fly from Morte Mame lands on their map. Lucinda swats it, and it sticks to Joplin, Missouri. Next stop, Joplin. In Chicago, ex-professor Dublin Morse, now a projectionist, takes some acid to spice up his job. He sees a fly on the projector lens, and in his hallucination, it tells him to go to Joplin and get an egg. Lastly, in Wichita, Kansas, Martin Sevenbirds is up on a power line, fighting his fear of heights, when he sees a spider eat one of the flies. The spider then weaves Joplin, M.O., into its web. Marty takes that as a sign and heads to Joplin. So all these folks end up at Legs Benedict's Egg Museum in Joplin, where Bunny Benedict, the museum's guardian, is waiting for them. She explains the museum's history and the monuments it's built around. An earthquake cracks the floor, revealing a stairwell. Winston's kitten Zinc bolts into the darkness, so the group grabs lanterns and follows. They find a granite rock blocking a chamber doorway, manage to move it, and discover the bodies of Morte Mame's previous harrowers along with a prison. The seal on the prison has a message in Latin, Sex liberabit, si enigma explicita edit, meaning six shall release if the puzzle is solved. They realize they need to speak the Latin phrases, enter 6 individual chambers, and the room starts spinning. Morte Mame appears, explaining they are the new harrowers, chosen to fight Leviathan Cenobites. She gives them weapons infused with a life force to even the odds in their battle. Morte Mame tells our ragtag group of heroes, aka the Harrowers, that they'll be following in the footsteps of the previous Harrowers, whose remains they just found. Not exactly a morale booster, right? To make matters worse, she warns them that Leviathan has sent his elite squad, the Lucky Six, to stop them. But here's the cool part. Morte Mame gives each of them some divine superpowers. As they head back up to the surface, Winston has a mind-blowing realization. He's seeing through Zinc the kitten's eyes. Turns out the kitten's been nabbed by Merkova, a Cenobite with a horse's skull face. Fun fact, Merkova's not just any Cenobite, she's Pinhead's girlfriend. Meanwhile, Bunny is hanging from the ceiling by hook chains. Classic Cenobite style. Winston does this wild teleportation trick, swapping places with Zinc, and ends up right in front of the Cenobites. Merkova, being her nasty self, threatens to turn Zinc's intestines into a bracelet. Winston's not having it, and he chops off her arms with his battle axe. Yeah, she's supposed to be tough, but Winston makes it look like a piece of cake. The rest of the Harrowers regroup and take on the Cenobites with their new weapons. Dublin Morse uses his invisibility to sneak up and stab a Cenobite cowboy. Ron Ringwood jumps into the fray, but gets snagged by hook chains. Just as things get hairy, Vera saves him from a nasty fate with a boomerang. But then Vera gets captured by the chains. She calls out for Morte Mame, who responds by making Vera's blood and saliva acidic to the Cenobites. This new power is a game changer. Vera's blood burns the demons, forcing them to let her go. She even spits on one, dissolving it completely. Meanwhile, Marty Sevenbirds, the pacifist, helps Ron when Merkova attacks again. Despite having her arm chopped off, she's still fighting. Marty stabs her in the thigh with his sword, forcing her to retreat. He frees Ron, who heals instantly thanks to his new Wolverine-esque regeneration power. Alright, so Lavinia and Lucinda are too freaked out to jump into the fight, but Morte Mame's got their back. She conjures up this guy named Ovid, who looks like a baby with insect wings and pointy ears. Oh, and he's super flatulent. Apparently his human-like farts throw the Cenobites off balance. He peps up the twins, saying they're stronger than they think. Morte Mame gives them a new power, creating mirror images to confuse the demons. The twins use this to lasso the demons with Ovid's farts, adding to the chaos. Marty Sevenbirds gets the power to generate lightning and starts hurling bolts at the Cenobites, stunning them. The Harrowers then chop the demons into pieces. However, Murkova manages to escape and drags Bunny back to Hell. Morte Mummy tells the group that Leviathan's commander, the General, will pay for his soldiers' failure. She says they need to rescue Bunny from Hell, which makes sense since she's been guarding Morte Mummy's tomb all this time. As the Harrowers get ready to dive into Hell, Leviathan gives the General one last shot to redeem himself. The General creates this horrifying monster called the Fury from the body parts of his fallen Cenobites and sends it after our heroes. The group battles the monster while Ron Ringwood speeds through Hell on his motorcycle, looking for Bunny. Marty sacrifices himself by electrifying himself and tackling the Fury into the deepest pit of Hell. Meanwhile, Pinhead, who finds Bunny amusingly transgender, is about to use a blowtorch for some impromptu surgery when Ron bursts in on his bike. He cuts Bunny's shackles with his axe, and they escape before Pinhead can do any real damage. Marty's sacrifice frees Morte Mummy from her prison. Ron and Bunny return to the Harrowers, and Morte Mummy briefly impregnates herself with Bunny's essence. Bunny then comes back to the group, and Morte Mummy explains she has 24 hours in her current form before she changes into something. When Bunny asks what she'll become, Morte Mummy says it's up to destiny and vanishes. In Hell, Pinhead is mourning the loss of his girlfriend, Murkova, after she was wounded by Marty Sevenbird's divine sword. He vows she wouldn't have died in vain. 24 hours later, the Harrowers gather in a park in Joplin to witness Bunny's transformation. And what do you know? She turns into a little girl and runs off to play with other kids. Morte Mummy appears and tells them their mission isn't over. Leviathan has many souls that need freeing, so their journey is just getting started. Back in Hell, the General is on his knees, begging Leviathan for another chance to take down the Harrowers. He's all fired up, declaring, "This time, it's war." Later on, Vera takes a trip to Hell to help out Kate Johnson. She kills Aparius, Hell's beekeeper, and tracks down the tree roots binding the trapped souls of Kate's family. Vera takes out the queen bee and bleeds on the tree roots, which frees the souls for Morte Mummy to cleanse. Kate and her husband get a final 24 hours together before his transformation. After that, Vera heads off into the unknown. Although these were the craziest of the Hellraiser stories, I'd like to give special mention to 3 other stories. In these blue depths lie Hell, The Girl in the Peephole, The Last Laugh. So yeah, that was all in this one. If you've reached this part of the video, I take it that you're a fan, so I insist you check out our playlist on Hellraiser. We have such sights to show you. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.